Ezekiel chapter 38 verse 1 through 3 reads, "The word of Yahweh came to me, Son of man, face Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, This is what the Lord Yahweh says. Look, I am against you, Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal." And we'll see the phrase, "I am against you," both here and in chapter 39. And this phrase is sometimes rendered by scholars as "I challenge you." And this is Yahweh challenging Gog to a duel or to combat. But before we analyze the details of this combat, as we of course will as we proceed, we need to first address the issue that has perplexed scholars, commentators, and students of the scriptures for millennia. And that question is, who is Gog? Many have sought to identify the entity known as Gog in Ezekiel 38 and 39. And Stephen L. Cook, in his Ezekiel commentary in the Anchor Bible series, says, quote, "The name Gog may be punning on the name Agaku, one of Marduk's names in the Babylonian Enuma Elish," end quote. And Dr. Cook puts that forward as a suggestion, and it's just one suggestion amongst many others. Because all attempts to identify Gog historically have failed. And this is because, in the words of Cook again, Gog is, quote, "physically real, but of mythological, fantastic, and archetypal proportions." And Cook goes on to say, quote, "Ezekiel 38 and 39 describes earthly reality invaded by the chaos monster Gog, with whom God grapples with hooks in the jaws. Across mythologies, half-imagined denizens of darkness wriggle away their lives in such crevasses as Gog's cavern, deep in the roots of Mount Zaphon. Thus, J.R.R. Tolkien's Balrog dwells deep in the mines of Moria. Consider Gog of Magog a Balrog eschatologized. He is at once both mythic and realistic. When a visionary's eye sees a Balrog archetype appear incarnate within terrestrial reality as Gog, a proto-apocalyptic revelation has occurred. Certainly Revelation, a full-blown apocalypse, had no doubt that Gog was an end-time fiend, an end-time monster." Now, I had no plans to do an in-depth analysis at this point of Ezekiel 38 and 39. I had other things that I was planning on looking at, other commentaries and other studies I was planning on preparing. But when I read that, what I just read, when I read that statement in Cook's commentary, I was immediately fascinated and thought, okay, I need to take a break from the other things I'm working on and do an analysis here of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Because as a student of prophecy, as someone who's enjoyed Bible prophecy for a long time, I've heard a lot of things about Gog over the years, and some of it, of course, a lot better than others. But still, there was never something that I felt really had great explanatory value. And when I read this about from Cook, and then seeing how he develops this idea, the statement that he just made, I thought it was fascinating, and so I wanted to do a deep analysis of this and then bring it to all of you. So hopefully you find it as interesting as I do, and we will continue here with it. But again, at the end of this video and in the description, I will cite the sources, the commentaries that I've used, in case anybody wants to check them out further. But Stephen L. Cook's is the one that I will be relying on most, because he writes just this way and brings out this mythological aspect of Gog, which I think is, again, the correct way of looking at it. Again, it's the way that makes the most sense to me out of everything that I've heard. And Cook describes Gog using Tolkien's Balrog as sort of a blueprint, as sort of a, as he calls it, an archetype. So let's take a few minutes here to discuss what J.R.R. Tolkien had to say about the Balrog. And I want to thank my friend Zach here at this point for helping me with the Tolkien mythology. But in writing about the Balrog, Tolkien says that Balrogs were demons with whips of flame and claws of steel. And this phrase reminded me immediately of Daniel 7:19, which says, "Then I," and it's Daniel, says, "Then I wanted to be clear about the fourth beast, the one different from all the others, extremely terrifying, with iron teeth and bronze claws, devouring, crushing, and trampling with its feet whatever was left." Now, I'm not placing the Bible and Tolkien on the same level, obviously. Tolkien was writing fantasy. But I also believe that it can be helpful to our understanding to reference works like Tolkien's, because Tolkien wove biblical themes throughout his mythology. And right up front here, as I said, we're going to be discussing mythology, so a definition of myth will also be helpful and necessary right here. And myth is defined as a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. So myth can be true. And that is what I believe is going on here in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Gog is being described using mythic language, but he is a real entity. Just as we've looked previously in the channel about the Leviathan when we were in Nahum and Jonah. The Leviathan is described using mythic language, but I do believe it's a real entity. The same thing here with Gog. So, continuing a little bit more with Tolkien, in the Silmarillion, Balrogs were called scourges of fire and demons of terror. So recall Daniel described the fourth beast as extremely terrifying. And in Tolkien's world, only dragons rivaled the Balrog's destructive capabilities. And we'll be looking at dragons in our study of Ezekiel 38 and 39 as well, as Gog is also depicted using dragon language, very strong dragon associations with Gog. And we'll look at that as we continue. And the power of the Balrog came from their angelic nature, and similarly Gog is a dark supernatural being. And he, as Cook said, Gog will invade the terrestrial realm at the end of days. There's a scholar named Heinish, and I couldn't find his first name, but he's cited by Walter Zimmerli in Zimmerli's Hermeneia commentary on Ezekiel. And Heinish believes that Gog is the personification of darkness. And this view is based upon the Sumerian word Gug, which means darkness. So if Gog, the name Gog, is derived from Gug, as Heinish suggests, we could see how this personification of darkness in the entity Gog could be realized. But again, other scholars don't believe that Gog comes from this Sumerian word Gug. But just like with it seems like with all of the scholarship on Gog, there's nothing that's really been settled in the scholastic community. But they all put forth various suggestions, and I thought that was an interesting one, especially after having just discussed Tolkien and the Balrog, because the Balrog lived deep in the mines of Moria in the darkness. So I thought that was interesting that Heinish believes that Gog is the personification of darkness. And also a word here as we get going on the terminology of apocalyptic literature. As Cook used the phrase proto-apocalyptic to describe Ezekiel 38 and 39, I thought it would be good to have a little bit of the definition of apocalyptic literature as well. So apocalyptic literature is literature that transcends space and time. It contains cosmic visions often described in terms of war between light and darkness. There is no peace or coexistence between the supernatural forces of light and the supernatural forces of darkness and rebellion. And Ezekiel 38 and 39 is an early form of Jewish apocalyptic. And again, it's Cook, the one who calls these chapters proto-apocalyptic. And the book of Revelation is perhaps the most well-known example of Jewish apocalyptic literature. And Joseph Blenkinsop, in his commentary on Ezekiel in the Interpretation Commentary series, says that Ezekiel 38 and 39 can be seen as transitional between prophetic eschatology and the apocalyptic visions of Daniel and Revelation. The importance of Ezekiel 38 and 39 is also seen in the fact that this prophecy about Gog echoes throughout the prophets that followed Ezekiel. And Cook suggests that Zechariah chapters 12 and 14, Daniel chapter 11 verse 36 to 45, and most famously Revelation chapters 19 and 20, and those chapters name Gog and Magog specifically, that all of these chapters are influenced by Ezekiel 38 and 39. And again, that's the view of Cook. Some scholars also suggest that Joel was influenced by Ezekiel 38 and 39, but this depends on the dating of Joel. But I'm going to read Joel chapter 2 verse 20, and I think you'll hear immediately the connection between Ezekiel and Joel. So Joel 2:20 says, "I will remove the northerner far from you, and drive him into a parched and desolate land, his vanguard into the eastern sea, and his rear guard into the western sea. The stench and foul smell of him will rise, for he has done great things." And this sounds very much like Ezekiel's description of the slaughter of Gog and his hordes in chapter 39. Gog has also been a subject of fascination for the Jewish community, just as he remains so for the Christian community. The Jewish community has had a lot to say about Gog over the centuries. The Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan in Exodus chapter 40 verse 11 says, "And thou shalt anoint the laver and its base and consecrate it on account of Yehoshua thy minister, chief of the Sanhedrin of his people, by whose hand the land of Israel is to be partitioned." Okay, and here we get into the really fascinating part of the verse and the entire reason for the citation, because it goes on to say, "And of Meshiha bar Ephraim, who shall spring from him." Let me take a minute to explain Meshiha bar Ephraim. Meshiha is the Aramaic word for Messiah, and bar is the Aramaic word for son of. So right here, this phrase, Meshiha bar Ephraim, is Messiah, son of Ephraim. And there were traditions within the Jewish world that there would be a Messiah, son of Joseph, who would suffer for the people, and a Messiah, son of David, who would be the conquering king. Now, what's fascinating is that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled both of those. He was the son of Joseph by adoption, and he was the son of David according to the flesh, as Paul says in Romans chapter 1. So this Targum here that's talking about the Messiah, son of Ephraim, Ephraim was the son of Joseph. So Messiah, son of Ephraim would be another way of saying Messiah, son of Joseph. So Messiah bar Ephraim, who shall spring from him, by whose hand the house of Israel is to vanquish Gog and his confederates at the end of the days. So let me just reiterate what this is saying here, that this Targum in the book of Exodus, this is Exodus. This is not even a prophetic, what we would think of as a prophetic book. This isn't the Targum of Ezekiel or the Targum of, Joel or Isaiah. This is the Targum on Exodus. And in this Targum, we read that the Messiah is the one who will kill Gog, and that this victory will occur at the end of the days. And this phrase, the end of the days, will be important as we continue in Ezekiel, because Ezekiel uses the phrase, the end of the years. There's also a Targum of Numbers 11:26 that's interesting. In Numbers 11:26 talks about Eldad and Medad, who were two of the elders of Israel, and it says that they were prophesying in the camp. Now the Masoretic doesn't say what they were prophesying about, but there's a fragmentary Targum of Numbers 11:26 which says that Eldad and Medad prophesied that King Messiah would defeat Gog's army. And Rashi, the medieval Jewish sage, confirms that Eldad and Medad prophesied about Gog. And Rashi also says that Zechariah chapter 14 is about Gog's attack against Israel. And Numbers 24 verse 7, both the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch speak of a coming ruler from Jacob who will be exalted beyond Gog. So I'm going to read that verse out of the Septuagint. It's Numbers 24 verse 7. And in the context, this is Balaam's prophecy of Israel. So it says, a man will come forth from his seed, and again in the context is speaking of Jacob, the people of Israel. A man will come forth from his seed and prevail over many peoples, and he will be raised up higher than the kingdom of Gog, and his kingdom will increase. And Cook says here, Numbers 24 verse 7 would have attracted the interest of the Ezekiel authors, since the Balaam oracles, like the Gog prophecies, are about the end of days. Thank you for listening. I'll post the next segment in the study of Ezekiel 38 and 39 in the next video. If you like the content, please like, share, and subscribe to help the channel grow. And here is the list of sources that I've used to compile this study. Thank you. God bless.